Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a deep, systematic look at complex subjects, extracting the essential knowledge you need without the overwhelming information flow.
Today, we are setting aside the popular, simplified images of prayer wheels and, benevolent lamas to explore the truly staggering intellectual architecture of Tibetan Buddhist thought.
We're diving into the millennia-long debates, the fierce logic, and the sophisticated scholastic battles that form the very internal structure of this tradition.
And it's a really essential shift in perspective for you, the listener, because focusing solely on compassion, while vital, it misses the rigor.
Right.
Tibetan Buddhism is supported by centuries of intense philosophical scrutiny, drawing deeply from Indian logic and metaphysics. We are investigating the reasoning that underpins the devotion, the framework that demanded monks master debate and philosophy before they even contemplated higher meditation.
And to start, we really need to understand this fundamental split that defines the lived reality of the faith. It's a split that's perfectly captured in a classic anecdote. Imagine yourself in the mid-1970s in a remote part of Nepal. You're sitting with a highly learned Lama, and you're deep in a conversation about the ultimate nature of consciousness. He's pondering his 8th century Indian text that asserts the mind cannot be an object to itself. This is high-level philosophy.
This is world transcendence. The ultimate aim of the Buddhist path. Transcending the confines of cyclic existence, probing the very limits of self and perception.
Exactly. But this serene moment of, ultimate philosophical inquiry is violently interrupted. Suddenly the door bursts open and 2 local peasants arrive. The text describes them as pallid and visibly quaking with fear.
And they aren't worried about emptiness, about shunyata.
Not at all. They're worried about their livelihood.
Their crisis is immediate, it's tangible. A demon, they report, had entered their cattle shed the night before.
It was kicking up sparks, crackling with negative energy, and it almost caused a stampede, which for them would mean economic ruin for the family. They needed ritual protection, and they needed it now.
And this is that collision point you mentioned, the urgency of world maintenance meeting the abstraction of world transcendence.
And the genius of the Lama, the ideal spiritual guide, is that his shift in focus is instantaneous. It's seamless. He doesn't dismiss their genuine terror as some kind of superstition. He immediately seats them, offers them tea, and just engages fully in their crisis.
He gets out his tools.
He gets out his tools of divination. He consults his astrological almanac. He rolls these specialized dice, and he's counting numerological combinations on his rosary. He's using his specialized knowledge, his high learning, to address their immediate mundane problem.
What stands out to me is the synthesis there. He eventually concludes, using his methods, that it was a passing disturbance of the elements due to minor faults of past karma, but the explanation is almost secondary to the solution.
Exactly.
He provides tangible ritual relief. The rite of saying, which is a kind of incense fumigation dedicated to pacifying local spirits. He tells them to immediately start reciting the mantra Om Mani Padme 1,000 times daily.
And he gives them knotted protection cords, consecrated pills, things they can hold.
Right. He acts in service of their reality, recognizing that for most people lay and often clergy, 2 spiritual objectives begin with avoiding misfortune, ensuring productive cattle, pacifying spirits.
It's about maintaining a stable, ordered world.
Absolutely. And only once the frightened couple leaves, visibly reassured by his intervention, does the Lama look up, smile gently, and say, "Where were we? Ah, yes. Mind cannot see mind, wasn't it?"
And that synthesis is the profound point. The Lama, embodying the superior spiritual goal of the bodhisattva, motivated by vast compassion and armed with superior learning and insight.
That's the world transcendence part.
Right. And he's compelled to act in service of the world at large. That's the world maintenance.
The deep philosophical structure we're about to explore is what enables that efficacy. It's the framework that provides the tools, both logical and ritual, for a total engagement with existence.
So our mission today is to deep dive into that very complex internal structure. We'll navigate the philosophical, logical, and theological arguments, moving beyond popular images to understand the rigorous scholasticism and metaphysical debates that define Tibetan Buddhism's development, all to understand the deep reasoning behind the faith. Okay, let's unpack this history, starting with the establishment of the foundation. The political roots of Tibetan religion, they trace back to the 7th century, right?
Right, to the reign of Songtsen Gampo, who unified the Tibetan plateau and, crucially, adopted a writing system derived from Indian models. This really prepared the ground for the influx of Indian doctrine.
And while Songtsen Gampo's marriages to the Chinese princess Wenqing and a Nepalese princess brought these early, powerful cultural influences, including the famed Jowo image to Lhasa, the definitive implantation of Buddhism wasn't exactly immediate or smooth.
Not at all. The pivotal moment, the real turning point, arrived over a century later under the great benefactor Trisong Detsen in the mid-8th century.
And his conversion, as you mentioned, wasn't just some academic or political decision. It was a very pragmatic response to a crisis.
Precisely. Early in his reign, Buddhism was subject to periods of intense resistance, even outright bans. It was only after severe epidemics began afflicting both the human and livestock populations that, in desperation, the court recalled Buddhist rites.
And they worked.
They worked. When the epidemics rapidly subsided, the perception of Buddhism as functionally effective as a powerful tool for world maintenance was cemented. He definitively adopted the faith around 762 CE.
And this immediately crystallized the core Buddhist doctrines that would structure the nascent empire. His edicts, as they're summarized in the sources, affirmed three inescapable concepts revolving around moral causality.
Absolutely. The foundational concepts he affirmed were starkly clear. First, the law of karma, or le in Tibetan, which means action. Beings revolve perpetually in this painful cycle of birth and death, samsara or korwa, due entirely to their accumulated deeds.
And the results ripen upon oneself. There's no escaping personal accountability then.
None. Second, the structure of rebirth. The 6 realms. Birth in any of these, from the highest heavenly stages through the human realm and the anti-gods, down to the hungry ghosts, animals, and subterranean hells, is strictly determined by one's own deeds.
So the universe is morally structured, and your deeds are the architect of your fate.
Exactly. And third, the solution. Transcendence. Enlightenment, or nirvata, yangde, is attained through provisions of merit and gnosis, which must be accumulated by the individual through spiritual practice.
It's striking that in this formative imperial phase, they immediately concern themselves not just with what the truth was, but with how they could validate that truth.
Yes.
And this is what pulled them into Indian epistemology and logic, laying the foundation for all future scholasticism.
This is the revolutionary aspect. They introduced the 2 valid sources of knowledge, or prama. This meant that the validity of their foundational cosmology, the belief in karma, rebirth, and transcendence, had to be supported by reasoned analysis, not just faith or received scripture.
So what were these 2 sources of valid knowledge?
First, you have direct perception, pratyeka. This is what is immediately evident, requiring no prior conceptual processing. For example, the immediate good or evil consequences of a simple action. You touch a hot stove, you perceive pain directly. That's direct perception.
Okay, we see that immediate cause and effect, which provides concrete proof of physical causality. But the second source, inference, anumana, that seems to be where the intellectual heavy lifting begins.
Inference deals with what is hidden, what you don't directly perceive, but which can be rationally inferred from the evident and therefore is fit to be held with certainty.
So you don't directly perceive the entire workings of karma across infinite past lives.
But you infer its certainty based on the observed moral imbalance in the world and the predictable nature of moral causality. The rigor of prama meant Tibetan scholars would always prioritize reasoned analysis as the path to certain knowledge, a precondition for the development of the monastic universities.
So once the cosmological stakes, karma and rebirth, and the means of knowing, logic, and inference were established, the next task was mapping the actual spiritual journey. And this brings us to the famous organizational framework of the 3 vehicles.
Right. As delineated by the translator Yeshe De in the 9th century, a vehicle, like a bridge or a boat, is the conveyance used to traverse the torrent of samsara. The 3 paths are distinguished primarily by the scope of their motivation and their ultimate philosophical view.
Okay, describe the first 2 paths, the Hinayana, or narrower vehicles.
We begin with the vehicle of the pious disciples, the Sharavaka. Their entry point is the understanding and realization of the 4 noble truths. Their primary philosophical insight is the selflessness of the individual and Atman.
So they view samsara as trouble and nirvaka as peace, and their motivation is solely personal liberation.
That's it, freedom from suffering for themselves.
Then the next one, the somewhat solitary realization.
The vehicle of the self-awakened ones, the Pratika Buddha, they enter via meditation on the 12 limbs of dependent origination, pratityasamutpada. They pursue enlightenment for themselves, purifying virtues but conspicuously acting without much compassion.
They're often depicted as solitary figures, achieving realization without relying on a teacher or serving others.
Which is why they are largely a theoretical construct in Tibet, lacking a large practical following.
And finally, the vast compassionate path that defines the Tibetan system, the greater vehicle, or Mahayana.
This is the comprehensive path. It's defined by the cultivation of both wisdom and compassion. Its ultimate view is radical. All entities are empty, shunyata, of inherent existence. Therefore, samsara and nirvana are ultimately not two. The separation we perceive is conventional.
And relatively speaking.
Relatively, entities are objectified as apparitional, like illusions, and the action is infused with great compassion bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is committed to practicing the 10 transcendent perfections over countless lifetimes to achieve enlightenment for the purposes of self and all others.
This delineation of the path, especially the Mahayana's commitment to infinite gradual practice, immediately sparked one of the most fundamental philosophical confrontations in Tibetan history.
Yes, the debate over sudden versus gradual enlightenment.
This happened after the Tibetan conquest of Dunhuang, when the Chinese Chan master Mohayan brought his views to the imperial court in the late 8th century. His position was profoundly challenging to the methodical, Indian-based approach.
Very much so. He argued for sudden enlightenment. His fundamental critique of the gradualist path was that awakening is immediate and intuitive.
So if the truth is ultimate emptiness, then one must contemplate the non-conceptual, the pure, unconditioned state.
Exactly. To engage in years of accumulating merit and striving through doctrines is just piling up further concepts and obstacles. He used this analogy of his teaching being like the eagles alighting from the sky upon the top of a tree, a spontaneous, immediate realization, a pure panacea descending from on high.
That raises a critical question, though. If the truth is already present and immediate, why bother with ethical effort? It sounds like it renders moral effort optional.
That's the core of the problem, yes. Mohayan implied we are already awakened Buddhas. We just fail to recognize it. The problem is one of recognition, not accumulation. But the gradualist camp, led by the Indian scholar Kamalashila, offered a rigorous rejection of this idea.
And Kamalashila fundamentally challenged that eagle analogy.
He did. He argued that the eagle does not just spontaneously appear fully grown at the treetop. Its wings must gradually mature before it can fly and alight. He stressed that enlightenment requires the methodical application of reasoned analysis, which eliminates conceptual errors, and the gradual cultivation of the moral and intellectual virtues. Compassion, for instance, is not instantly perfect. It has to be trained, like a muscle.
And the sources show that Tibetan tradition ultimately favored the gradualist approach, which cemented the emphasis on scholastic training.
It did. But the philosophical tension inherent in the debate, are we striving toward a goal or merely recognizing a pre-existing state, that seems impossible to ignore.
It never disappears.
It never disappears. It becomes the underlying dynamic of all subsequent Tibetan thought. If the ultimate reality is the luminous, primordially pure mind, as some later schools argued, then the entire elaborate system of karma and moral perfection serves only as the necessary scaffolding required to make the mind ready to recognize what was always present. This tension between recognition and realization is what drives the entire path.
So, assuming the gradual path, how do you manage and motivate countless lifetimes of striving? The solution requires a clear, ethical framework that manages motivation.
Right, and that brings us to the influential work of the Bengali scholar Atisha, who established the Kadampa tradition after arriving in Tibet in 1042.
His lamp on the path of enlightenment provided this foundational ethical progression for virtually all Tibetan schools that followed.
It's an incredibly accessible system for self-assessment. He structured spiritual development into 3 clear grades of aspirant, based purely on their motivation.
Walk us through those 3 stages, starting with the baseline motivation of, say, the non-spiritual person.
The lesser person. This individual is defined by striving only for the comforts and pleasures of this life, or seeking favorable rebirths purely for his own sake. This motivation, while perfectly natural, still keeps him firmly locked in the cycle of samsara.
Okay, then the next grade achieves personal liberation.
That is the middling person.
Yeah.
This individual has internalized the suffering inherent in samsara and strives for his own peace, rigorously shunning sinful deeds. This motivation aims for the individual cessation of suffering, the goal of the Shrivaka path we mentioned earlier.
And the defining motivation of the Mahayana tradition, the path of the bodhisattva.
That's the superior person. This aspirant is defined by their wholehearted dedication to ending the pain of others. Their commitment requires cultivating the enlightened spirit, bodhisattva, the fusion of wisdom and great compassion, and making an irreversible vow to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings.
So this ethical framework ensures that progress is always tied to universal concern, not just personal achievement.
Exactly.
That clarity helps define the goal, but to break the mind out of its deep-seated, self-centered habits, a systematic reorientation is required. This is achieved through the 4 reversals of attitude, the Lodok Namji.
These are 4 profound contemplations designed to undermine our most cherished assumptions about existence. First, you reverse clinging to this life. You meditate on the preciousness of human birth, which offers this unique opportunity for practice, and you contrast that with the utter certainty of death and impermanence, making any mundane attachment seem, well, foolish.
So that first step is about prioritizing spiritual life over material life. What is the second contemplation target?
It targets a kind of spiritual materialism, clinging even to the idea of a favorable afterlife. You reverse clinging to favorable rebirth by intensely contemplating the ubiquitous suffering found in all 6 realms of samsara, including the transient pleasure of the God realms.
You realize that any state within cyclic existence is characterized by pain.
And you recognize the infallible operations of karma that govern every single rebirth.
Once that disaffection with cyclic existence is complete, you turn outward, right?
Yes. Third, you reverse striving for personal liberation. You do this by fully cultivating bodhisattva-generating loving kindness and compassion for all beings, recognizing them as having been your own mother in past lives. You reject the narrow goal of personal peace and replace it with the universal goal of enlightenment for everyone.
And finally, the insight that anchors the entire endeavor.
Fourth, you reverse clinging to ephemeral things as real by contemplating emptiness, or shunyata. You realize the illusion-like, uncompounded nature of all conditioned existence. This realization provides the liberating wisdom necessary to practice the first 3 steps without attachment or ego.
These 4 concepts provide the theoretical reorientation. But how do you make the bodhisattva ideal, concrete, and immediate in daily life?
That's the job of lojong, or mind training. Lojong is the practical application of the superior attitude. It's the constant discipline of bringing abstract spiritual ideals into thought, speech, and action. It instructs practitioners on how to transform the most mundane acts into spiritual opportunities.
The sources offer a wonderful illustrative example from the 13th century, showing how the high-ranking Lama Pakpa gave advice to a Mongol noblewoman, adapting the practice to her specific non-monastic life.
It's fantastic. Pakpa provided context-specific vows that spiritualized her routine. He advised, "On crossing a river, say, may I traverse the torrent of sorrow.
And when you see an empty pot, say, may I be empty of faults.
When you see a full pot, say, may I be full of good qualities." Every single action, from seeing a utensil to traveling, becomes a moment of conscious ethical commitment. This approach ensures the path is holistic. It doesn't just happen on the cushion.
The most famous and radical application of this mind training is the visualization practice of Tonglen, sending and receiving. It's a profound exercise in dissolving the barrier between self and other.
Tonglen is the emotional core of Mahayana practice. The visualization is structured around the breath. With the inhalation, you imagine absorbing all the sufferings, pain, and negative karma of all beings in the world, taking the form of black smoke which dissolves into your self-cleaning ego and destroys it.
A radical act of taking on the world's suffering.
Yes. Then, with the exhalation, you emit a radiant, clear white light of love, healing, peace, and ultimate happiness, sending it out to touch and relieve every single suffering being. The entire point of the exercise is the radical exchange of self and other, training the mind to value the other above the self, until that priority becomes spontaneous.
This practice leads directly back to the ultimate wisdom, emptiness. Atisha was clear. This supreme insight must be imbued with compassion.
And he drew a crucial boundary on the role of theoretical reason when it came to realizing emptiness. Atisha was following the tradition of Nagarjuna, emphasizing that philosophical discourse, while vital, serves a critical function, not a constructive one.
So its role is primarily to dismantle our presuppositions, to strip away the ingrained error of believing things have inherent, concrete reality.
Precisely. The intellectual debate is the tool of elimination, but it is not the actual means of realization.
I see.
Atisha explicitly stated that investigations of perception and inference were formulated by the learned specifically to refute the disputations of non-Buddhists, not necessarily to achieve the ultimate truth. The ultimate realization of emptiness must be achieved through direct contemplative insight.
But that sounds like a contradiction. If philosophical discourse is only a tool for elimination, why did the monastic colleges spend centuries perfecting the very logic they claimed was ultimately insufficient?
Because the mind cannot realize the ultimate truth until the false structures are completely destabilized. Logic acts as the necessary acidic solvent. Once that conceptual scaffolding is dissolved, the wisdom of emptiness validates the entire moral progression.
I see.
Atisha summarized this beautifully. When the adept realizes emptiness without error, this wisdom continually graces them with all 6 perfections: generosity, moral discipline, forbearance, and so on, because the mind is free from attachment and intellectual grasping toward the 3 spheres of subject, object, and interaction. The realization is the perfection of morality.
The need for this acidic solvent, this rigorous reason, led directly to the rise of monastic scholasticism.
It did. From the late 11th century, institutions like Sangpu, founded by Atisha's successors, became centers for highly rationalized systematic doctrine. They systematized philosophical inquiry in a way that hadn't been seen before.
The monastic college, or dritsang, was an intellectual powerhouse.
Their core curriculum became standardized around the 5 great textual traditions. The Dzogchen Ga. You couldn't become a master without fluency in all 5. Pramak for logic, Prajnaparamita for wisdom, Abhiharma for metaphysics, Vinaya for the monastic code, and Madhyamaka for the middle way philosophy.
So it ensured a student was equally versed in how to live, how to think, and the nature of reality.
Exactly. And the practical crucible for this knowledge was the art of formal debate, Tilcher. This wasn't some gentlemanly exchange of ideas. It was a high-pressure physical performance, often held in a courtyard.
The structure itself was rigid. All claims had to be expressed as a logical implication followed by a warranting reason.
The basic form is, it is implied that X is impermanent, because sure, it is composite. The questioner tries to find a fault in the implication, the reason, or the major premise supporting the reason.
So if the opponent challenged the reason, the debater had to immediately supply the underlying logical principle.
Exactly. It is implied that composite things are impermanent because, as the Buddha has said, all composite things are impermanent. The process was designed to explore the deep logical implications of textual assertions, forcing clarity and consistency.
But the function of debate was complex. While it aimed for logical purity, it also served as intense pressure training.
Oh, yes. The vivid ritualized gestures, the clapping, the stamping, the verbal assaults were designed to mimic a combative environment. Adherence to purely logical criteria was sometimes secondary to the objective of winning, or at least surviving the intellectual onslaught.
Which meant novices were often publicly humiliated, rejected, and scolded for not grasping the basic application of implication and reason.
Or for showing too much intellectual hesitation. The system was designed to produce sharp, fearless scholars who could defend their doctrinal position against any rival.
That required mapping out the territory, which meant mastering the perspectives of the 4 major philosophical schools, moving from a concrete to a more abstract understanding of reality.
The 4 schools provided that systematic delineation. First, you have the Hinayana views. Vedika, which held a purely atomistic reality and believed perception was direct. Objects existed externally and were perceived immediately as they were.
Then the Sautrantika, who softened that directness.
They asserted that perception is indirect. You don't directly perceive the atoms. You perceive phenomenal forms caused by interaction with sense organs. The object itself is momentarily glimpsed and gone.
And then you move to the Mahayana views, starting with Yogacara or Sensam, mind only. That was the move toward idealism.
Right. They argued that subject and object are mere aspects of non-dual cognition. Everything we perceive is a manifestation of the mind.
And finally, the ultimate view that the Goluk and other dominant schools championed, the Madhyamaka, or middle way.
Madhyamaka argues that Yogacara goes too far. By affirming non-dual cognition, Yogacara mistakenly posits a concrete, existing absolute entity, the mind itself. Madhyamaka asserts that reality is ultimately beyond all conceptual thought and speech.
So emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. It points to the intangible nature of reality, and crucially, the concept of emptiness must itself not be grasped as an ultimate concrete fact.
Exactly.
This systematic, highly rationalized approach led to the most explosive metaphysical eruption in the 14th century, the debate over the absolute, often framed as the intrinsic versus extrinsic emptiness controversy.
This focused heavily on the concept of Buddha nature and the ground of all. On one side, you had Dolpopa of the Yonangpo order, who championed extrinsic emptiness, or Zentong.
Help us understand that concept. I mean, in layperson's terms, what is Zentong?
Dolpopa argued that the ultimate reality, the fundamental Buddha nature, was not empty in the way Madhyamaka defined it, which is to say, empty of inherent existence. Instead, he said the ultimate reality is a plenitude, permanent, eternal, self, and pure.
So it's only extrinsically empty.
Right. It's empty only of the conventional temporary reality, the world of suffering and impermanence. It's full of ultimate reality, but empty of relative reality.
That sounds suspiciously close to non-Buddhist concepts of a supreme permanent self.
And that is exactly what the critics accused him of. It was highly controversial. Critics condemned Zentong as tacitly adhering to Hindu teachings of a supreme self, or Paramatman. This was a fundamental contradiction of the Buddhist doctrine of non-self and Atman. For many scholars, affirming anything permanent, eternal, or self, even at the ultimate level, was doctrinal suicide.
Meanwhile, schools like the Nang Mapa, particularly Longchen Rinpoche, tried to chart a path that recognized a certain fundamental purity without falling into Dolpopa's trap of affirming a permanent self.
Longchenpa focused on the Dzogchen, or great perfection view. He resisted Zentong, but also fiercely criticized scholars who reduced emptiness to a bare vacuity, or nihilism.
So for him, emptiness is the unconditioned, primordially pure character of ultimate reality, the ground where Buddhahood is an ever-present possibility.
Yes, this ground is luminous. He argued that the problem is not a lack of reality, but a fundamental failure of recognition. He said, if the inherent structure of such a ground is not recognized as it is, there comes to be unawareness. Due to that, having errantly constructed the apprehending subject and apprehended object, one wanders in the three realms.
Karmapa Rangung Dorje also engaged this complex problem by carefully differentiating terminology related to the ground of all.
He was navigating the Yogacara concept of the alaya vijnana, or storehouse consciousness, which holds all the seeds of karma and phenomenal experience.
So how did he distinguish it?
He distinguished between the gnosis of the ground of all, the alaya jhana, and the consciousness of the ground of all, the alaya vijnana.
Help us distinguish those two. Is that like separating the potential from the pollution?
Precisely. The alaya vijnana is the defiled, polluted conceptual basis that gives rise to samsara. It carries the karmic seeds. But when that consciousness is purified and transformed through realization, when it sheds the mistaken notion of subject-object duality, it becomes the alaya jhana, the pure, unconditioned gnosis of that same ground.
So the ultimate reality is the ground of everything, but our experience of it can be either defiled or pure.
Yes, consciousness or gnosis.
This philosophical ferment eventually led to the great logical synthesis of Jade Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa order.
Tsongkhapa firmly rejected Zentong and championed the Prasoika interpretation of Madhyamaka, which uses indirect reasoning reductio ad absurdum to establish emptiness. His synthesis was built on an ironclad commitment to reason as the ultimate authority, second only to direct realization.
He asserted that appealing to scripture alone is insufficient.
That's right. Reason is required to eliminate the inflated opinions and conceptual errors that keep the mind bound. Logic isn't just a tool. It's the necessary cleanser for the mind, enabling it to penetrate the illusion of inherent existence.
And he used that commitment to reason to tackle one of the most persistent philosophical riddles, the continuity of karma. How can an action in the past produce a result in the future without affirming some permanent holding entity like the Yogacara ground of all?
This is where Tsongkhapa proposed his famous and very innovative causality argument, that the annihilation, sikpa, of a deed could act in a causal stream, just like a positive, enduring entity.
Wait, let's stop on that for a second. That is incredibly radical. If annihilation acts as a causal stream, that fundamentally changes how we view time, existence, accountability.
It's a huge shift.
Help us understand that causality argument. If the deed is annihilated, how does it still cause a future result? Is that like setting off a domino where the first domino is gone, but the chain reaction is irreversible?
That's a good analogy for the chain reaction, but Tsongkhapa's critics argued his specific formulation was problematic. Tsongkhapa essentially argued that because ultimately nothing has inherent existence, not a positive entity nor a negative entity like annihilation, they are conventionally equivalent in their ability to function causally. The moment the action ceases, its annihilation, its cessation, begins its causal influence on the mind stream until the result is achieved.
But this formulation was immediately attacked. I can hear the critics arguing that he pulled a rabbit from a dialectical hat.
They did. Critics like the Sakyapa scholar Garumpa Sonam Sengye argued that this proposal was absurd. Garumpa said Tsongkhapa's theory implied that karma and its effects are totally different, since at the level of conventions they are set off from one another by an intermediary, namely annihilation as a real entity, just like two mountains that face each other are set off from one another by the river.
So if annihilation is a real entity, conventionally speaking, it separates the deed from its result, making the connection arbitrary.
Precisely. And this philosophical sparring over the precise nature of conventional reality and causality forms the bedrock of much of the subsequent history of Tibetan Buddhist thought and debate.
So we've covered the moral progression of the bodhisattva and the fierce, rational, scholastic logic necessary to dismantle conceptual error. Now we turn to the final piece of the tapestry, Tantra, or Vajrayana, which accelerates the path by shifting the focus from cause to effect.
Tantra is the vehicle of fruition. If sutras teach a causal vehicle, you cultivate causes across countless eons for future enlightenment. Tantra teaches that the fruit of enlightenment is already here. The core principle is learning to perceive the ordinary world as a Buddha realm, perceiving your own body, speech, and mind as the body, speech, and mind of an awakened being.
That's a massive conceptual leap. If the fruit is already present, what are the key characteristics that define the tantric approach to unlocking it in the here and now?
There are 6 major characteristics that distinguish this path. First, mantra, or nigak. These aren't just prayers, they are spell-like formula, often focused on a particular deity, designed to protect the mind from intellectual engagement in mundane discursive thought. They focus consciousness entirely on the divine reality.
Second, the mandala. We see these diagrams everywhere, but they are much more than art.
Much more. They are schematic diagrams representing the divine palace of the central deity. The mandala functions as a map. It symbolically correlates the macrocosm, the external universe and the realm of the deity, with the individual microcosm.
So a 5-deity mandala would correspond precisely to the transformation of the 5 skandhas, the aggregates of existence, and the 5 defilements into the 5 types of pristine wisdom.
Exactly. And before you can even approach the mandala and the internal practices, you require the avika, or consecration.
The initiation, the 1 quarter.
It's non-negotiable. The disciple is initiated into the mandala and must assent to special vows, or samaya. The initiation acts as the ritual and psychological transformation, where one's body, speech, and mind are consecrated as the indestructible reality, the Vajra body. You are not authorized to practice without this ritual transmission.
Then comes the central mental practice, visualization.
Tantric visualization isn't daydreaming. It is the rigorous, creative imagination focused on self-identification. The meditator transforms themselves into the central divinity. Every feature of the deity, from the ornaments to the color and posture, is precisely visualized and embodied.
And critically, all external objects and forms that appear are likewise transformed into the deity, dissolving the duality of self and other within the meditative field.
Yes. This leads to the most controversial aspect, the affirmation of sensual pleasures.
The transgression.
The transgression. Unlike the sutra path, which might renounce sense objects, Tantra affirms them, but through ritual engagement. This is not ordinary indulgence. Sensory pleasure is utilized precisely within the program of practice. The sensory faculties are seen as opportunities for realizing the non-dual nature of bliss and emptiness. As Sushin Kunga Nimpo taught, the enjoyment of objects becomes like deity melting into deity, transforming the energy of desire into the energy of awakening.
And finally, these practices culminate in the highest yoga,
which aims to achieve union, or yoga, with the ultimate reality. While the creation stage involves visualization or data yoga, the perfection stage involves the internal yogas that target the subtle energies of the body. The channels, or nadis, and vital points, chakras. The goal is to unite the dispersed energies, or winds, into the central channel, forcing swift liberation in one single body and lifetime. Practices like inner heat, tumo, are the specialized technology for achieving this accelerated path.
The ultimate exemplar of this accelerated path is Milarepa. His life story illustrates perfectly the intense purification required before the fruit can ripen.
Milarepa's initial sin practicing sorcery and killing dozens of people meant he was initially a defiled vessel. His guru, Marpa, demanded harsh, grueling trials, including forcing him to build and tear down stone houses until all his pride and negative karma were ostensibly broken.
It serves as the great cautionary tale.
Absolutely. Tantric practice demands unswerving, absolute devotion to a qualified teacher and a vessel purified of ego, resentment, and negative karma.
And once purified, he was initiated into the 6 teachings of Naropa, which allowed him to achieve realization so quickly.
These teachings included the mastery of tumo, inner heat, enabling him to live high in the caves of the Himalayas in only a thin cotton robe, his famous Ripa designation. By mastering the illusory nature of appearances and the luminosity of the mind through these internal yogas, he demonstrated the capacity to realize enlightenment in a single lifetime, a single body, making him the template for the vehicle of fruition.
Milarepa's immediate trials contrast sharply with the institutionalized path most practitioners undertake today, which begins with the obligatory preliminary practices, or engendro.
Engendro is the foundational training, typically requiring 100,000 repetitions of 5 core practices: prostrations while taking refuge, the bodhisattva vow, the Vajrayana purification mantra, symbolic mantala offerings of the cosmos, and guru yoga worship of the divinized guru.
This ensures the necessary prerequisites for renunciation, compassion, purity, and faith are deeply ingrained before entering the high-level practices. It mitigates the risks inherent in working with powerful internal energies.
Right, and the final culmination of this path is often done collectively in 3-year retreat.
The Losum Chuksum retreat.
3 years, 3 fortnights. It's where they move through the sophisticated stages. They begin with the extensive creation stage, where the visualization of the deity is perfected, followed by the perfection stage, where the internal yogas are mastered, culminating in the non-conceptual contemplation methods of Mahamudra or Dzogchen, aimed at directly recognizing the subtle radiance of the mind that finds its ground in emptiness.
As we transition from the high-level internal yogas to the external realities of community and cosmology, we have to address the intense focus on mortality. Tibetan Buddhism is arguably defined globally by its approach to death, centered on the intermediate state, or Bardo.
The concept of the Bardo is a profound philosophical achievement. It was developed in Indian Buddhism specifically to solve the problem of continuity. If there is no enduring self or soul, the core doctrine of Enlightenment, how does causality, how does karma, bridge the gap between 2 successive lives? The Bardo, the 49-day passage, is the bridge that links one consciousness stream to the next.
And tradition holds that the experiences during this period are profoundly influential on rebirth.
Absolutely. Consciousness, devoid of a stable physical body, experiences intense sounds, lights, and visions that determine the course of the next rebirth. The most famous ritual text, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo Todrol, is recited to the deceased's consciousness, guiding them through this terrifying landscape.
And the core instruction is recognition.
It is. The deceased must understand that the terrifying lights and wrathful deities they encounter are all manifestations of their own awareness.
The ultimate lesson being that if you recognize the display as non-dual projections of your own mind, you attain liberation.
Yes. And the failure to recognize the display, the hesitation, the conceptual grasping, the doubt, is what causes the consciousness to spiral down and choose a new, unfavorable rebirth, leading back into samsara.
The practitioner's ability to directly influence this moment, for themselves or others, is tied to the practice of pawa.
Pawa, or transference, is a high-level tantric practice intended to cause consciousness to depart suddenly through a forced opening at the crown of the skull and be projected to a specific auspicious realm. It's a solution that bypasses the potentially chaotic and perilous Bardo state.
And the most popular destination for this transference is Sukhavati, Amitabha's land of bliss. This Pure Land tradition seems to be the great democratizer of the afterlife.
That is the philosophical logic behind its popularity. Amitabha's vow stipulates that those who simply maintain faith in him and his realm and are morally upright will be born there. You do not need the rigorous, multi-eon accumulation of merit required of an advanced bodhisattva to be born there.
So it offers a path to an auspicious rebirth for virtually everyone, a radical departure from the strict meritocracy implied by some of the Sravaka schools.
It is, and the practice was deeply integrated into daily life. Sakyapatita's sleep meditation on Amitabha is an example of conditioning the mind for the moment of death. The practitioner is instructed to lie on their right side, make the vow, and visualize themselves and their environment as the Pure Land. The key move is visualizing their mind dissolving into Amitabha's heart, unifying the trinity of Buddha, meditational deity, and their own mind.
So this daily conditioning practice minimizes the chance of doubt or error at the moment of death, ensuring a peaceful transition to Sukhavati.
That's the idea.
While the Pure Land offers some democratization, the reliance on strict personal karma remains central. But the concept of merit can be communally generated, which is powerfully illustrated by the popular Delak narratives, the Revenants.
The Delak literature provides first-person, often sensationalized testimony about journeys to the underworld. Their purpose is profoundly ethical and political. They uphold the moral law of karma and provide definitive proof of Buddhist cosmology, reinforcing the moral universe for the masses.
The classic legend of Chowang and his mother highlights the tension between strict personal accountability and the power of communal merit.
Chowang's mother, due to her overwhelming greed and arrogance in life, falls straight into the sealed iron chamber in the pit of hell. Chowang, driven by bodhisattva, tries to take on her suffering, but Yama, the Lord of the Dead, informs him that karma is infallible.
But his merit can help others.
Right. Chowang's merit can secure the release of tens of thousands of other lesser sufferers through recitation of Avalokiteshvara's mantra, but his mother remains incorrigible. She is eventually reborn as a dog receptive to his teaching, showing that while karma is strict, communal merit-making, like sponsoring rites or recitations, remains essential for mitigating the suffering of the deceased.
This intense structure of spiritual obligation, the vows, the accountability, is also leveraged for institutional and social cohesion.
Particularly through the tantric vow and the rise of the trilku.
Yes, explain that.
The tantric vow, the samaya, is an inviolable oath-binding master and disciple and fellow Vajra brothers and sisters. In a traditional society that placed immense value on sworn oaths and fealty, the samaya acted as a spiritual supercharger, enforcing social and political allegiance. The transgression of samaya was believed to result in immediate catastrophic rebirth in the infernal realms, providing powerful enforcement and social control within the monastic and elite classes.
And the spiritual fealty was institutionalized through the emergence of the trilku, the recognized incarnation.
The trilku system, first formalized by the Karmapa line and later defining the structure of the Dalai Lamas, designates a child as the reborn emanation of a deceased master, who is seen as an emanation of a Buddha or bodhisattva. This fundamentally altered the power structure.
How so?
It allowed monasteries to gain independence from specific aristocratic families because the next trilku could be found anywhere, disrupting entrenched hereditary control.
Which is the mechanism that eventually transformed Tibet into an ecclesiastical state.
Exactly. The trilku institution became the fundamental instrument binding the social order through generational spiritual obligation, reinforcing the Dalai Lama's hegemony across the country through the expansive network of tantric vows that connected the Gelugpa-led administration to clergy throughout the nation. It was a perfect blend of high theology and political structure.
We have completed this deep dive, charting a course from a demon in a cattle shed to the intense philosophical battles over causality and the vast social power generated by tantric vows. What becomes abundantly clear is that Tibetan Buddhism is far from a monolithic entity.
Not at all. It is a dynamic, contentious, and deeply reasoned tradition.
And this internal contention was often endemic and sectarian. So it is fitting that we end with the 19th century Rimé, or nonpartisan, movement in Kham, championed by thinkers like Mipam Nongale, which attempted to find philosophical consensus among the various schools.
Mipam's argument wasn't just for tolerance, but for an actual intellectual solidarity based on shared philosophical bedrock. He asserted that despite the fierce scholastic debates, all Tibetan orders affirmed the Four Seals.
The bedrock tenets.
Impermanence, suffering, the selflessness of conditioned things, and the peace of nirvana. Furthermore, he argued, they all affirmed the great unelaborate emptiness, even if they debated its conventional presentation, and they all affirmed the tantras, teaching the coalescence of bliss and emptiness as the highest path.
And he concluded that their views and systems are similar, they are exceedingly close.
Right. His call for unity was a plea for survival, urging adherents to regard one another as does a mother her child, or as does a beggar a treasure, arguing that mutual enmity would only lead to ruination. It is a powerful reminder that philosophy, logic, and survival are intrinsically linked in this tradition.
Indeed. We have seen how Tibetan Buddhist thought successfully wove together these disparate elements. The practical rituals required for world maintenance, the strict logical syntheses demanded by Tsongkhapa scholasticism, the radical universal compassion of the Mahayana, and the esoteric intensity of tantric visualization and internal yoga. It is a highly robust intellectual system.
And we see that intellectual rigor continuing today, fueling the ongoing dialogue between Buddhism and Western science, particularly cognitive sciences and physics.
The focus remains on the intellectual and contemplative facets.
That dialogue is highly productive because of the tradition's long history of empirically observing the mind. But there is one major area where reconciliation remains conspicuously absent, and that is evolutionary biology. This remains a philosophical difficulty because Buddhist conceptions of karma and continuity presuppose a moral causal chain that spans infinite past and future lives, which is challenging to reconcile with a purely materialistic, non-moral physical evolution.
That's a fascinating philosophical gap to consider in the modern context. But to bring us full circle, let's return to the source of all this contention, the ultimate philosophical question raised by Mohan and Kamarshila, the tension between inherent awakening and the gradual path.
If we look at the pinnacle views, whether it's Dzogchen or Mahamudra, they constantly stress the unconditioned, primordially pure nature of ultimate reality. The state of enlightenment is fundamentally present.
So this raises the essential and provocative thought that still resonates today. If enlightenment is already inherent, why the elaborate methodical system?
Does the vast architecture of karma, scholastic debate, moral perfection, and the immense hierarchy of vehicles serve merely as complex, necessary scaffolding to make the mind capable of recognizing what was already there? If that's the case, then what does it say about the very necessity and the ultimate reality of the immense effort and struggle of the path itself? It leaves you questioning everything you just learned.